The situation in Afghanistan is putting the so-called special relationship between the UK and the US under great scrutiny. This is why. Back in January, when Joe Biden became president, Boris Johnson was the first leader he called. And on America's alliances, we also heard this from Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
We get so much more done with them than we could without them. So we're making a big push right now to reconnect with our friends and allies.
The desire to move beyond Trump was palpable. That was March. In April, President Biden announced he'd implement Trump's plans to withdraw from Afghanistan.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
The president also said he'd consulted with his allies, but the withdrawal wasn't what the UK wanted.
It's not a decision that we'd hoped for, but we obviously respect it, and it's clearly an acknowledgement of an evolving US strategic posture.
The UK was soon to have the chance to explore this evolution close up. The G7 gathered in Cornwall with Joe Biden the central figure and Boris Johnson the host.
You call it the deep and meaningful relationship, whatever you want, the indestructible relationship.
President Biden was equally effusive.
We affirmed the special relationship, as is not said lightly, the special relationship between our people.
That was June. Also in June, the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was now at full tilt. By early July, its central facility, Bagram Air Base, had been abandoned. By mid-August, the Taliban were on the outskirts of Kabul. By Sunday, the 15th of August, the Taliban were in the presidential palace. The government had fallen. And this was the worst-case scenario for the US and the UK. A 20-year shared endeavour to build a democracy was gone, replaced by a desperate rush to get people out. That was on the Sunday. Joe Biden didn't call Boris Johnson. On Monday, the urgency of the situation intensified. Joe Biden still didn't call Boris Johnson. They eventually spoke on Tuesday, over 48 hours after the fall of Kabul. The next day, Boris Johnson explained the UK's position.
The West could not continue this US-led mission, a mission conceived and executed in support and defence of America, without American logistics, without US air power.
A mission executed in defence of America was now ending on a date of America's choosing, the 31st of August. And going into a G7 meeting on Tuesday, the UK was clear. It wanted the date pushed back.
Everyone knows that the rest of the international community wishes to have more time, but there are two other people with a vote in that is the Taliban and the President of the United States. And in the end, both of them had significant power in that final decision.
President Biden didn't change his mind. The date stayed. And as this all played out, the former head of UK Joint Forces Command, General Richard Barrons, argues we've relegated our security and prosperity and our interests to the will of US national politics. But is this relegation or just how it's always been? Watching from Washington, the BBC's North America editor John Sopel wrote that what was happening is a statement of the reality of the special relationship, which, when push comes to shove and when America is feeling cornered, isn't so very special. And in John's article, he thinks back to this moment in 2001, when then UK Prime Minister Tony Blair visited Washington after the 9/11 attacks. In the months to come, he'd provide UK support for America's invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. 20 years on, he's had this to say.
Many people, as a result of what's happened in Afghanistan, are going to have a deep doubt as to whether we can be relied upon. And that is not a good thing.
And Mr. Blair's fierce criticism of Joe Biden's withdrawal also raises a question about whether the UK can rely on the US. But when the UK Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, was asked today if the US refusal to extend that deadline meant the special relationship was over, he replied, no, of course it isn't. It matters a huge amount. And if that's the UK perspective, this is US State Department spokesperson Ned Price last week.
We certainly have an extraordinary partner in the British government.
To back that up, Mr. Price added,
what I can say is that our coordination with the British government, with all of our NATO allies, has been consistent, it has been clear, and there has been a consensus on this.
But that's only the case if consensus is the US deciding a policy and then the UK and others going along with it because there's no other option and not because they agree. It is a relationship. Special's one word for it. Others are being used too. Well, let's speak to Sebastian Payne, Whitehall editor for the Financial Times, who presents Payne's Politics, a podcast you should all subscribe to. Great to have you on the programme, Sebastian. Thanks for your time. How would you categorise the relationship at the end of August?
Well, it's the first real split between President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson since the last US election. And, when President Biden came in, he was very much trying to argue that America is back. We're going to reconnect with old allies. And he made sure that the first call as president he made to a foreign leader was to Boris Johnson. And one of his first overseas visit was to the UK. And of course, he visited the Queen at Windsor Castle as well. So of the symbol and pageantry of the special relationship is all there. But the question's always been, when it comes to hard policy, where's it going to land? And here's your answer. We know that Mr. Johnson tried to lobby the president to keep a US president, either military or diplomatic. He declined that over several months. So the personal relationship between those two is not in the best state, but the special relationship, as some people call it, goes much deeper. The fact we share intelligence, the fact there are clear military and strategic aims that unite the UK and the US, they don't change. And I can't think of a single US president that hasn't fallen out at some point with a UK Prime Minister. So maybe it's inevitable. The question is, where does it go next? And of course, we've got the big COP26 climate summit, which Boris Johnson was keen to use as a symbol of UK-US relations being on the same page, even sharing the same slogan of build back better from the coronavirus pandemic. But once again, let's see the policy, let's see if they agree on that, as opposed to just the rhetoric and the sound bites.
So from what you're saying, we need to wait to see if these tensions are specific to the Afghanistan crisis or symptomatic of something broader.
Indeed, and I think obviously there are tensions, there's been no doubt about it, and the folks that I've spoken to across Whitehall have made it very clear that Boris Johnson, Ben Wallace, the UK Defence Secretary, and others were very unhappy with this decision, but they ultimately can't do much about it. Their hands were tied by the US President. They might not like it. I think the key thing to watch now is we get into the run-up to COP26. Is there a meeting of minds between Boris Johnson and Joe Biden? There should be. They've adopted very similar policies on achieving net carbon zero. They want to do the same things towards climate change. But the question is, in terms of NATO, the West, and the military, does the UK feel it's been so burnt by this it can't rely on America anymore and try to find other allies? And it did try to do that the UK tried to speak to other NATO members and to the NATO organization itself to form an alternative coalition, but that went nowhere. So it really exposes what happens if you don't have the special relationship, if you can't rely on America, then it's just a big yawning gap in British foreign policy, and nobody really wants to address that because it would be such a problematic thing for Brexit Britain.
I wonder if it's a yawning gap, Sebastian, or whether actually what we're seeing is simply something that's always been there, that the US is the more senior partner in this relationship. It may be special at times, but in terms of seniority, there's no doubt who's top of the pecking order.
That's very true, and I think ever since the Second World War, that has been the case. And whether you look at it in terms of sharing nuclear missile programs, if you look in terms of foreign policy, Iraq war, you name it, across the whole spectrum, all the terms nearly dictated to by America, and obviously that's only going to increase as the geopolitical balance continues to adapt. I think the key thing the UK wants to sell is its convening power. We've still got that seat on the UN Security Council. We're still a key member of NATO, one of the biggest military powers within Europe. And what Boris Johnson has been trying to sell himself over the past week is saying, okay, we didn't like this decision, we were forced into it by America, but we can still bring people together, have a meeting of mind, and try and achieve something that way. But again, what's actually been achieved here? We had that G7 summit, a virtual summit meeting this week, which Boris Johnson brought together, and ultimately they came up with a slightly mealy-mouthed statement that said we're going to talk to the Taliban about trying to keep those evacuations going. It's not really hard action here, and it's not something the UK is just doing exactly what the US is doing on this because they are the dominant military force and every NATO member knows it.